April was just an ordinary little girl. You got the little kids' picture on the milk cartons, and you always keep telling yourself that that's never going to happen to you.
It was very unusual for a child to disappear in broad daylight.
You're out there screaming and hollering, yelling, April.
This guy raped and murdered a child. It rocked the whole city.
Then another young girl goes missing, and her case ends up being a homicide also.
This monster was still on our streets. They were stalking young girls, bragging, saying that they were going to take more children.
I kept saying, we will find the person that did this. But I wasn't expecting it to go 30 years. All the kids got out of school at 11:30. It was April Fool's Day plus Good Friday.
8-year-old April Tinsley is excited to play with her friend down the street.
Nicole was April's best friend. She always wanted to play with Nicole. I walked her to the alley where I could see her crossing. She turned around and waved at me.
April's mother, Janet, tells her to be home by supper time.
She yelled, okay, and she goes, I love you, and then she went on to Nicole's house. April's supposed to come home between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. She didn't come home. So I called up there. Nicole's mom asked Nicole if April's still playing, and she goes, no, she was supposed to go home. It was strange. It was never like her at all. You're out there yelling for April, and all of a sudden it was like panic mode.
April Tinsley vanishes.
When I was 16 years old, I told everybody if my first child was a little girl, she's going to have blonde curly hair and blue eyes. And her name was going to be April Marie Tinsley. And that's what I got. Me and Michael, we got married in 1979. April was born March 18th, 1980. Everybody says she was like me because she was shy and bashful. She loved Christmas. She always loved to help decorate. You would tell her, get the ornaments out, and she'll help put them on the tree. The tree will be full on the bottom, but it'd be naked on the top. I would have to help her with the rest of it.
April is 6 when her little brother Paul is born.
She was excited to have the brother. She was a good helper. She was always overprotective of him. And all of a sudden they're giggling and rolling all over the floor. She'd always be climbing trees. She was more of a tomboy.
I pulled up in front of the house one day, and she was jumping off the porch. I'm like, you're going to break your leg, kid. But but that's what kids do. The neighborhood was great. We had a small park that Janet and Mike would take April to. People knew each other on the street. Yeah, it was a nice enough neighborhood. Right up until 1988. And things changed.
I called the police department, and I had to file a police report. And the first thing they did was had her as a runaway, an 8-year-old. I said she had no reason to run.
I have a police scanner, and I had taken my wife out, but we got home after dinner and turned on the police scanner, and I heard missing girl, and they gave the address. I told my wife, that is Mike's address. That first night we went there, Janet was kind of frantic. She was, a mother, you don't mess with the mother's child. Mike, I don't want to say he was calm, but he also was hoping that April was at a friend's house and just didn't call. My wife stayed with Janet while Mike and I were out till probably 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, just walking up in the alleys and the railroad tracks. It was a long, hard day. There was a huge law enforcement presence the next day.
This was kind of a gloomy, rainy day. Fort Wayne Police Department began doing a canvass and a search. They were assisted by the K-9 Division, the Mounted Patrol. We still had a horseback division. In 1988, we don't have the internet, we don't have cell phones, Amber Alerts aren't going out. It was significantly different. It was newspaper, radio, and television.
One of the detectives down there, and they helped us with a flyer that had her picture as seen. Please call this number, putting them up.
The case of the missing girl makes local headlines.
The search started out small. Then all of a sudden there was close to 300 people.
Janet stays close to home, waiting for any news. She's caught between hoping for the best and fearing the worst.
It might have been like 2 days that I didn't eat very much. If April ain't eating, I don't eat.
As the day grew longer, I didn't want to say it, but I was thinking it was not going to end well.
It rattled a lot of people in a sense of they were scared to have their kids walk home from school.
A tip came in from 2 younger girls. They saw somebody matching April's description being pulled into a blue, later model pickup truck by what they described as a male white.
The witnesses say the young blonde girl was crying. They thought it was a family argument until they heard about April's disappearance.
Law enforcement began looking for the blue truck, making traffic stops, and interviewing the individuals who owned or drove those blue trucks to see if they had any information.
Investigating every blue truck will take months. Meanwhile, police run down all other leads.
Law enforcement's worst fear was that April was taken or abducted, and we knew that time was of the essence. Law enforcement was working round the clock to ascertain any information as to April's whereabouts.
A jogger in DeKalb County, which is the county directly north of Allen County where Fort Wayne is located. Jogging down County Road 68, he happens to look over into a ditch near the roadway, and he sees a young girl, deceased, laying in the ditch.
On April 4th, our community got the worst news possible.
When you have a horrible crime like that happen puts the community on edge, not knowing who did this, why they did it, or are they planning on doing it again? The jogger ran to a nearby house, called 911. Police responded to the scene of the ditch on County Road 68 and immediately began processing the crime scene, looking for clues, trying to figure out who the young girl is.
The body was not far off of the roadway. It didn't appear that the killer was trying to hide her body. Law enforcement immediately ruled it was a homicide.
There was not much evidence on the body that was visible to the naked eye.
She was discovered wearing the same clothes that April had been reported missing in, and is identified as April Tinsley. So at that point, it goes from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation.
Investigators discover the killer had taken off April's clothes and put them back on.
She only had one shoe on. Law enforcement decided that this was a key piece of evidence and kept it very guarded.
A few hundred yards down the road, on the opposite side of the road from where she was found, was her other shoe.
Investigators suspect the shoe was tossed there.
There was not much there for police to go on other than the body and the shoe that had been located down the road. No tire tracks were located in the area, no footprints.
That same afternoon, Jenna Tinsley meets with reporters, trying to keep her daughter's case in the public eye. Police hadn't yet told her about their grisly discovery.
And then all of a sudden, here comes this big plain car. The one detective goes, we need to speak to you privately. And the other one looked at the news and says, the interview's over. We think you might want to sit down. There you go. We got a picture we want to show you. I knew it was her. I was really upset, crying. My husband and his nephew came in. I told him, I go, well, you and Tom can go and take the flyers back down. They found her.
April's body was removed from the scene and taken to the forensic center where an autopsy was conducted. She had been sexually assaulted and that the cause of death was suffocation by strangulation. Her clothing was taken into evidence.
In 1988, DNA technology was very new to law enforcement.
There was a DNA sample taken from her underwear that was preserved.
Monday, when I got home from work, my wife was sitting on the steps crying and informed me that they had found her and that she had died. We went straight over to Mike and Janet's to be with him. There was still a large police presence. Very little was said. It was just silence and shock.
Anytime police investigate a murder, it's not easy. It's not easy for the family of the victim. It's not easy for the police to deal with. And when you add the death of a child, it makes it more difficult.
It sent a lot of people on edge. The thought that a little girl could just be walking home from school and then just get snatched off the street and then raped and killed was huge.
Police have one possible lead. The girls who saw April getting into a blue truck also got a look at the driver. They tell police he's a white man, between 20 and 40 years old, with light-colored hair and stubble.
Police release a composite sketch of what the suspect could possibly look like. It's released in the local media. Several hundred tips came in, and at that point, we started to follow up on those leads.
They were everything from, I got a neighbor who's kind of odd, to I got a neighbor who's got a blue truck, to I have a neighbor that I think is a pedophile. You can't dismiss any one of them because any one of them could be the right one. Of all the hundreds of tips that came in, somebody believed they saw April Tinsley looking out the back window of this blue truck.
Law enforcement began a very focused and thorough investigation into the blue pickup truck. The Bureau of Motor Vehicles logs and records were pulled for all blue pickup trucks within Fort Wayne and surrounding counties, and ultimately most of northern Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. We tracked down if the pickup truck was sold, who it was sold to, or if it had been crushed or sold to a scrapyard.
Despite an exhaustive search, police can't find the elusive blue truck.
It was a beautiful funeral. It was just horrible. Lots of people showed up. Lots of people. Mike and Janet were in the front row. I just can't imagine how hard it was for them.
The day that we buried her was rough. Everybody goes up to the casket and says their goodbyes. I went up there and I put my head down on her head and told her that Mama loves you. You can rest now. I wouldn't let go. So they had to drag me out.
In the beginning, there was lots of leads to follow up on, lots of people to interview.
After a year, things slowed down.
Less and less leads come in. The leads come to a dead end.
A telephone call came into the Fort Wayne Police Department with a new tip.
Police get a report of writing on a barn. This barn is located in northeast Fort Wayne on Schwartz Road.
On the barn, they discovered a message that mentioned April Tinsley.
This was a big deal because it's the first lead they had in a while.
Law enforcement immediately drove to the scene.
Written in crayon, right on the front door of the barn. The message read, "I killed 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley. I will kill again."
Part of the message on the barn was, "Did you find the shoe?" The police did not tell anybody that there was a blue shoe missing.
The message written on the barn is written almost as if a child had written it. Police weren't sure if that's how they write. Are we looking at somebody with a possible mental disability, or are they purposely disguising their handwriting by misspelling words? It was actually sent to the FBI for analysis.
The FBI felt that the individual who authored this note was possibly trying to disguise their handwriting or mislead law enforcement.
Those notes on the barn really sent the community on edge. You have somebody who is taunting the community and saying, "Ha ha ha, I killed and I'll do it again." People were scared.
Shortly after the barn door rioting, another young girl was reported missing.
The missing girl is 7-year-old Sarah Bowker. She lives just a few miles from where April's body was found.
I actually lived probably 2 miles from her apartment complex.
Sarah's body is found in a creek bed close to an apartment complex on the north side of Fort Wayne.
Both girls were approximately the same age. They both had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and then murdered, and then left in a remote location.
There is one difference. April was found clothed. Sarah wasn't.
Given that they were so similar, police looked into if they were connected. Possibly we have the same person that committed both crimes. The FBI was brought in. They created a profile of what they believed the killer could be.
The FBI began poring over the evidence and quickly realized that the manner in which April's body was discovered and that of Sarah Bowker's did not appear to have the same trademarks.
And eventually it was determined through DNA, actually, that the person that killed April was not the same person that killed Sarah Bowker.
It was just a very, very horrible time in Fort Wayne, especially for these 2 young girls who were ultimately killed.
With no new leads, the case of April Tinsley goes as cold as a Midwest winter.
You can't leave the house without somebody pointing at you, taking pictures of you.
They were being harassed. If they went somewhere, people would point, there's that little girl's mom. It was a hard time for them.
Mike, he kind of had like a nervous breakdown. He was 34 years old when he had his first heart attack. And I kept saying, we're never going to know who killed her. You know, is it ever going to be solved?
A young girl in the Fort Wayne area was out playing. She was at her bicycle and discovered a note in the basket of her bicycle. Law enforcement was called by the family member of this young girl, and the note was provided to the police department.
Very shocking. Investigators had a mix of emotions. Is this really our killer that's leaving us another message? Or is it somebody that's just messing with them? One of the biggest questions is, why now? Why 16 years after April's murder?
15 days later, a second note was found on a bicycle belonging to a young girl, also very similar in age and look to April Tinsley.
The baskets contain more than just notes.
There were Polaroid pictures and used condom. They were very vulgar and graphic and sexual content.
Each note that's left, there were 4 found in total. Each note's addressed to the little girl as Hi Honey, that they've been watching this little girl. One of the notes even says that if they don't see this on the news, that they will blow up the little girl's house.
At first, I thought with all the clues and that he was leaving, I said, I hope they catch him before another child comes up missing and gets hurt.
The Polaroid photos depicted a gentleman from approximately the belly or waist down with his penis exposed, sitting on a bedspread. This bedspread appeared to be that of a paisley pattern, maybe some blues and greens.
Investigators think the bedspread resembles those from a cheap hotel.
Detectives canvassed all hotels and motels within about a 100-mile radius of Fort Wayne. It scared law enforcement to think that this killer was still moving around. Who is this guy? No hotels were able to say that that was a familiar bedspread. Not much was gained from the bedspread.
He's basically taunting the police, saying, "You can't catch me. I can do whatever I want. I will kill again."
For 16 years, April's killer has been getting away with it. Yet April's killer may just have handed detectives the biggest clue of all.
In one of his letters, he left a quote-unquote present. And that present the killer referred to was a used condom. By leaving this condom, they were providing us a very large DNA sample.
Police tried to compare any DNA from the condom to the evidence that was found on the clothing of April Tinsley at the time of her death. The DNA came back indicating that this could possibly be the suspect, but it was not 100% because at the time, DNA was still in a growing process. The question was, whose DNA is this?
Analysts run the sample through the FBI's DNA database of felons, but there's no match.
He thinks he's smarter than the police, and he thinks he's not going to be caught.
Two decades pass, and police are no closer to finding April's killer. Still, her mother never gives up hope.
We kept asking the police department, keep it in the media, keep it fresh. And they kept telling us that, no, they can solve their own murder cases. They don't need no outside help.
Desperate for answers, Jenna Tinsley reaches out for help of a different kind.
It's been a few years since the police department put anything out. I was sitting there, let me stir the pot. So I sent a email to John Walsh. We need like America's Most Wanted, the other crime shows that was on, to get the story out there.
In Indiana, there's a child killer running free.
We were hoping that it would trigger something.
If you know anything that can help investigators, please call our hotline right now.
The segment leads to 50 new tips.
It drew a lot of national attention.
Detectives go from having no suspects to having too many. Two new Fort Wayne detectives, Clint Hertrick and Brian Martin, take over the case.
With the advances in technology and the advances in science, our list of suspects had been whittled down to approximately 12 to 15 that would not provide a DNA sample to law enforcement.
Detectives hope to use new technology to rule their possible suspects in or out.
Early 2018, we began seeing media attention in reference to how genetic genealogy was used to identify the killer in the Golden State Killer case.
Detective Martin wonders if a genetic lab called Parabon might be able to use the same technique to find April's killer.
I decided to just pick up the phone and call. What do I have to do to give you a sample to try to figure out who killed April Tinsley?
Detective Martin gives Parabon a DNA sample collected from the condom.
7 weeks after we submit our sample, I receive a telephone call. They said, we got you two possible brothers that are your killer, and they're still alive.
Both of them were relatively close to the area, so we pulled their driver's license signatures. And one of the things we noticed was that one of the brothers' signature was very similar to the notes left on the girls' bikes.
One brother had some activity that we felt was very suspicious and fit within a profile of somebody who would conduct a crime, an abduction, rape, and murder.
The suspect's name is John Miller.
To tell you that we're excited doesn't even begin to touch the feeling that we had. We were working a 30-year-old homicide, and we now had a very strong suspect.
I was almost able to relax and think, okay, this is finally over, and now it's going to be closed for April's family. They can move on.
John Miller's residence was a trailer home in Grable, Indiana.
We wanted to learn who John Miller was, what he did, where'd he work at. Within a couple hours of beginning surveillance, I got eyes on him for the first time. He came out of his trailer, and he was actually cleaning the windows on his car. I was very surprised by his appearance. He was hunched over. I actually had to remind myself that this crime happened 30 years prior. We learned that most of the time he went to work and came home, and if he went anywhere, it would be to a store or to his brother's house. He worked at Walmart, which is approximately 20 miles away from where he lived. Myself and another detective went in plainclothes in Walmart, and we found him working in the children's toy area. I found it very disturbing that he was near kids almost all day during his shift.
Detectives need a sample of Miller's DNA to compare to the DNA found on April's body.
We decided in order to obtain his DNA, we were going to wait for trash day and for him to put his trash out to the curb. That night, after his trash was placed out by the curb, we actually pulled John Miller's trash from the bin and drove to a garage at the Fort Wayne Police Department.
They brought it to me. We laid it out on the floor. I went through the bags of trash looking for anything that would possibly have his, or more likely have, DNA on it. Going through the bags, I found a used condom. It was just amazing. As I continued to dig, I found 2 more. I found a total of 3 used condoms in the trash. This was at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I immediately drove to Indianapolis to deliver them to our DNA analyst to determine whether it was a match or was not a match to our suspect. 2 days later, we got the results back.
It's a match of John Miller's DNA to our murderer's DNA from 1988.
John Miller was the person we had been looking for all these years.
We decided that Detective Brian Martin and I were going to approach him when he got home from work on a Sunday morning outside of his trailer. As John Miller pulled up to his trailer, Detective Martin and I approached John Miller. We introduced ourselves and just told him that his name had come up in an investigation and asked him to come down to the Fort Wayne Police Department with us. And he was more than happy to do so.
So, John, we want to talk to you a little bit about a case that we've been working on for a while. And somebody brought your name up into this, and we wanted to kind of talk to you and see what you had to say about that. Do you have any idea what we need to talk to you about?
Well, I think probably the Tinsley case. That's the only one I can think of.
I kind of sat back in my seat, and I was surprised that he had said her name.
What would make you say the Tinsley case?
He didn't want to come right out and tell us what happened. We had to talk to him for a while, ask him questions.
What year that happened? Do you remember?
April of 88.
April of 88? Yep. Okay. So, you know that police have evidence in the case? Just to see just how much you know about it, so I know kind of what not to bore you with.
DNA.
Yeah, yep. We have DNA. When we did that DNA, we were able to narrow it down to you. I just can't help but think that you probably had an idea maybe at some point something like this could happen. Can you talk to me a little bit about how this accident happened and what happened back in '88? Will you share that with me?
I can't.
Why can't you?
I really didn't know what to expect going into the interview. We were hopeful for a full confession.
I think that this was probably an accident, John, and I'd like to, can you just tell me how? You can't?
His demeanor changed a little bit in the interview. You could tell he became very nervous. He was having a hard time telling us what happened.
You've already admitted to this by the letters and the condoms that you left for us. You wrote the letters, you left the condoms, and you were like, gosh dang it, why can't these police figure out what the heck I'm trying to tell them here? Right?
There was nothing in the paper for years. And
You wanted to be like, hey guys, get on the ball here.
she was walking down the sidewalk by herself and nobody was around.
So you were driving around, you were looking for a little girl to pick up, weren't you, John?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you get out and grab her, or did you say something to her?
I was already out standing by the car when she walked by.
So you knew you were going to try and grab her. What'd she say when you grabbed her?
She said, don't hurt me, I'll do whatever you say.
Okay. John, before she died, how did that happen?
Choked her.
You choked her? Why'd you choke her?
That's the only thing you can think of at the time. But
Were you afraid she'd tell on you?
yeah,
It surprised me that somebody could do this and live with themselves for 30 years and not tell anybody or not get it leaked to anybody of what they did.
Sunday afternoon, we were standing in my kitchen. I was talking to Mike, and I was looking out the window, and I seen 3 SUVs come in, a police cruiser and 2 black ones. It was the prosecuting attorney. First thing I looked out, Mike looked out, and they said, we got some news for you. They showed us a picture. Have you seen him around the neighborhood at any time? No. And they go, he worked at Walmart. That's all I kept saying is, okay. It's like, I was lost for words.
Police tell Janet this is the man who killed April.
Prosecutor Karen Richards notified Janet that an arrest had been made in April's murder.
Okay, you got your suspect. They said, how do you feel about it being solved? And I was sitting there. I went through 30 years not knowing who killed her. And all of a sudden you come to the house and tell me you got him. I said, it might take me a while for this to actually sink in. After they left, then you sit down and you have your crying spell. You're happy and you're crying. Finally, it's over.
News of the arrest travels fast, and many in Fort Wayne call for the death penalty.
All it took was one kid to walk home one night without adult supervision, and that could have been victim number 2.
Janet also wants Miller put to death.
He took her life. I want his life. He don't deserve to be alive.
Despite the DNA match and the confession, Miller pleads not guilty.
They ended up reaching a plea deal. I covered a pretrial hearing, and when I saw John Miller walk in, it was chilling.
They kept telling me that it's the best deal. I said, no, I want a trial. They didn't want to go to trial because they didn't want us to live through all the stuff that went on through the case.
Miller avoids the death penalty, but he's sentenced to 80 years. At age 59, that's life behind bars.
When we all was in the courtroom, he would never look at us. He would only look at the judge. Most of the time he looked at the table.
At sentencing, Janet finally confronts the man who killed her daughter.
I was the last person that got up there and spoke. I read my statement. I said, I want one question answered from you, but I know I will never get it. I want to know why. Why her? And the first words came out of his mouth was, he was bored.
In 2015, the community of Fort Wayne builds a memorial to April Tinsley.
I come to April's garden 3 to 4 times a week. I'll sit for 2, sometimes maybe 3 hours. There's usually a white butterfly comes and flies around. Everybody kept saying it was April flying around. It makes me happy to see the butterfly. When I feel down or I have a bad week, I'll come and sit on the bench and just sit here and talk to her. I'll say, April, Mama misses you more and wishes you was here. In a way, you know she's around somewhere.
The voice on the line did not tremble, did not rush, did not ask if anyone was listening. It simply spoke as if the truth had grown too heavy to carry any longer. And in that quiet Ohio police office, decades after the last patrol car rolled away from a bloodstained street, a cold case that had learned how to sleep was abruptly shaken awake. The caller gave no name, only a sentence that landed like a blow. You've been looking in the wrong direction since 1982. Then the line went dead, leaving behind a hum, a silence, and the uncomfortable sense that time itself had just been challenged. To understand why those words mattered, you have to go back to a town that believed in routine, in predictability, in the idea that nothing truly bad could happen there. Ohio, early 80s, a place of early mornings and factory whistles, of porch lights left on not out of fear but habit. The night she died began like any other. A short walk, familiar streets, the kind of evening no one would remember if it hadn't ended the way it did. She was discovered before sunrise, when the frost still glazed the grass and the sky was just beginning to pale. A jogger first, then a neighbor, then sirens. The body lay at an angle that felt wrong, as if even in death she had been interrupted. One glove missing, purse untouched. No immediate signs of struggle that made sense. Officers stood in the cold, radios crackling, staring at something they were not prepared to explain to a town that would soon demand answers. By mid-morning, the street was sealed. Yellow tape fluttered like a warning flag. Reporters gathered at the edge, scribbling notes, already shaping the story into headlines that would burn themselves into local memory. Police said little. They were still trying to understand what they were looking at. A homicide, yes, but how, and by whom, and why, were questions that slipped through their hands the moment they tried to grasp them. The victim was known, not famous, not powerful, just familiar. The kind of person whose face registered a half-second too late when you passed her in a grocery store aisle. That familiarity made the shock sharper. This wasn't a drifter. This wasn't someone passing through. This was one of theirs. And that realization changed the way the town breathed. Investigators worked fast. They had to. Pressure came from everywhere. City officials, the media, families who needed reassurance more than truth. Tips flooded in, some earnest, some unhinged. A man seen walking too quickly. A car idling without headlights. A scream someone thought they heard but couldn't place in time. Detectives chased each one, knocking on doors, taking statements, filling notebooks with fragments that refused to connect. Early on, a pattern seemed to form. Someone close. Someone familiar with her route, her habits. The crime scene suggested knowledge, not chance. Attention turned inward toward the neighborhood itself. Friends, co-workers, neighbors. Everyone was questioned, and everyone, it seemed, had an answer ready. Among them was a man who lived just a few houses away. Helpful, cooperative, always available. He had noticed the police activity immediately that morning, he said. He had stepped outside, curious, concerned. He offered small details that sounded useful without being specific. He remembered seeing her earlier that night. Nothing unusual, just a passing moment. In the chaos of the early investigation, his presence felt reassuring, like proof that the community was united against whatever had happened. But reassurance is not evidence. Weeks passed, then months. Leads that once felt promising collapsed under scrutiny. A suspect with a shaky alibi was cleared. Another left town, only to be ruled out later. Forensics in 1982 could only say so much, and what they could say raised more questions than answers. The cause of death was determined, but the method told no clear story. There was no obvious weapon, no clear motive, the kind of case that makes investigators doubt their instincts. By the first anniversary, the headlines had softened. By the second, they had become reminders rather than demands. Detectives rotated off. New cases took priority. The box that held the evidence grew thicker, heavier, harder to justify reopening when resources were thin and pressure was high. Officially, the case was still active. In reality, it was cooling. The town adjusted because towns always do. Fear gave way to caution, caution to routine. People still talked about the murder, but quietly, carefully, as if speaking too loudly might invite something back. The street where it happened became just another street again, though no one lingered there without reason. Children who had been warned about it grew up and warned their own kids. Inside the police department, the case settled into a strange limbo. Not closed, not solved, just waiting. Occasionally, a detective would pull the file during a slow shift, skim through the reports, shake their head, and slide it back into place. Too many dead ends. Too many maybes. The neighbor's name appeared again and again, but always in the margins, never underlined, never circled. There had never been enough to justify more. Decades passed like that, each year layering distance over urgency. Technology changed. DNA became a miracle word. Cold case units formed, armed with tools the original investigators could only have imagined. But even then, this case remained untouched. Evidence had degraded. Samples were incomplete. Witnesses had aged, or died, or moved beyond reach. It became the kind of murder people referenced as unsolvable. Until the call. The detective who took it didn't know what to make of it at first. Anonymous tips were nothing new. Most were noise. But this one was different. It didn't ramble. It didn't accuse wildly. It pointed calmly, deliberately back to the beginning. Back to the people who had never truly been ruled out. Back to the neighbor. When the file was reopened, it was with reluctance as much as hope. No one wanted to promise what couldn't be delivered. But as the documents were laid out again, something became clear. Assumptions had calcified into facts without ever being tested. Timelines accepted because they fit, not because they were proven. Statements taken at face value because everyone involved seemed ordinary, trustworthy. The neighbors' interviews were read again, line by line. On their own, they were unremarkable. Together, they told a story that never changed, not in wording, not in emphasis, not in error. Over 40 years, the memory remained pristine. Too pristine. Human recollection doesn't work that way. It frays. It shifts. It fills gaps with guesswork. But this did not. Detectives began walking the route she had taken that night. They timed it, measured sight lines, considered angles that had never been considered before. From a neighbor's front window, the street was visible. From a neighbor's yard, the path was clear. From a neighbor's position, opportunity existed in ways no one had articulated back then. When they approached him again, he was polite, older, grayer. He laughed softly at the idea of reopening something so old. He said he understood. He said he had nothing to hide. And for the first few questions, he was convincing. Then the details came. Minor ones. A light that had been on or off. A sound that came before another. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to introduce doubt. Enough to suggest that memory might not be as perfect as it had seemed, or that it had been rehearsed too carefully to bend. Word began to spread. Not officially, not publicly, but in the way rumors always do, seeping through conversations, glances, pauses. The past was no longer settled. The cold case was no longer dormant, and the town felt it, that old unease rising again, sharper this time, because now it came with the possibility that the truth had been living next door all along. As the investigation edged forward, one thing became undeniable. The silence that had protected this case for decades was cracking, and whatever lay beneath, it was closer, far closer than anyone had ever wanted to believe. Once the door to the past had been forced open, it refused to close quietly. The case file, yellowed and swollen with age, spread across the conference table like a map of mistakes, each report a footprint leading somewhere investigators had stopped following years ago. What had once been skimmed now demanded attention. What had been dismissed now carried weight. The cold case was no longer a relic. It was active, breathing again inside the walls of the department. Detectives started where they should have started in 1982, not with suspects, but with time. The timeline had always been treated as solid, anchored by witness statements that seemed to align neatly. She left work at a certain hour. She was seen on a familiar street shortly after. Her body was found before dawn. Simple, clean, too clean. When those times were placed under modern scrutiny, cracks appeared immediately. The clocks people relied on were never synchronized. Memories were anchored to television shows, dinner routines, assumptions. The margin of error stretched wider than anyone had acknowledged back then. Re-interviewing witnesses was an exercise in patience and restraint. Some were eager, almost relieved, to speak again, as if they had been carrying unfinished sentences for 40 years. Others were defensive, annoyed that the past had been disturbed. Many remembered less than they thought they did, their recollections softened by time, reshaped by decades of retelling. But even in the gaps, patterns emerged. One neighbor recalled hearing a sound that night. Not a scream, not a shout, but something dull and abrupt, like a door slammed too hard. Another remembered seeing a porch light flick on at an unusual hour. Small details, insignificant alone, but when aligned with a revised timeline, they clustered around a narrow window of opportunity. A window that pointed again and again toward the same stretch of houses. The evidence locker yielded its own surprises. Items that had been cataloged but never fully explored. Fibers whose origins had been impossible to determine in the 80s now held potential. A partial print, smudged and incomplete, dismissed as unusable at the time, suddenly mattered. Technology had caught up. The question was whether the past had preserved enough to work with. The forensic lab treated the old materials with a mix of reverence and caution. Every test was a gamble. Degradation could destroy what little remained. But slowly, methodically, results came back. Not definitive. Not yet, but suggestive. The kind of findings that keep investigators in the building long after the lights are supposed to go out. As the focus narrowed, the neighbor's name moved from the margins of the file to the center. His proximity, his availability, his consistency. Detectives reconstructed his movements on the night of the murder using records that hadn't existed or hadn't been considered in 1982. Utility logs, emploiement archive, old traffic patterns. Each new data point shaved away uncertainty. When they asked him for a second formal interview, his demeanor shifted subtly. Still polite, still cooperative, but something in his tone tightened, a defensiveness that hadn't been there before. He spoke carefully, choosing words like tools rather than thoughts. He corrected himself once, then laughed it off. The recording captured everything, including the silence between questions, the pauses where an answer was being built rather than recalled. Investigators didn't accuse. Not yet. They let him talk. They let him fill the room with his version of events, uninterrupted. And when they compared it to his earlier statements, the differences stood out, not as contradictions, but as refinements. Details added, emphasis adjusted, memory evolving in a way memory doesn't naturally do. Outside the station, the town was beginning to murmur. Someone had noticed the unmarked cars. Someone else had recognized a detective knocking on doors that hadn't been touched in decades. The story leaked, piece by piece, until the word everyone dreaded hearing again found its way back into conversation. Murder. Cold case. Reopened. Families of the victim felt it first. The hope was cautious, fragile, balanced against years of disappointment. They had learned not to expect closure, not to imagine answers. But the renewed activity stirred something they couldn't suppress. A sense that the truth, whatever it was, might finally be close enough to touch. The anonymous tip loomed over everything. Investigators replayed the recording, analyzed its cadence, its phrasing. The caller had known specifics that had never been public. Not just the facts of the crime, but the assumptions behind the investigation. They had known where the blind spots were. And they had chosen this moment, not earlier, not later, to speak. Speculation ran rampant inside the department. Was the caller protecting themselves? Was it guilt, fear, or simply the belief that time had run out? The possibility that the voice belonged to someone who had lived with this secret for decades added a layer of urgency that no piece of physical evidence could match. As forensic results continued to trickle in, the picture sharpened. The fibers matched a type of material common in the neighbor's home renovation during the early 80s. Not conclusive, but unlikely to be coincidence. The partial print, enhanced through modern techniques, narrowed the field further. It didn't provide a name, but it excluded many. It excluded almost everyone except one. Confronted with these developments, the neighbor's calm began to fracture. In a third interview, he asked questions of his own. Why now? What had changed? Who had said something? The detectives noted it all, the shift from cooperation to concern. People with nothing to hide rarely ask who is talking. The strategy was deliberate. Pressure without accusation. Facts without conclusions. They allowed the weight of the evidence, incomplete as it still was, to settle in the room. And for the first time, they saw it land. A flicker of something crossed his face, too fast to define, but unmistakable. Meanwhile, the cold case unit expanded its scope. They revisited other incidents from the same period, looking for overlap, unreported disturbances, minor assaults, anything that suggested a pattern. They found little, but what they did find hinted at a temperament, a tendency toward control, toward watching rather than acting impulsively. The community reaction intensified as whispers turned into headlines. Local news ran cautious segments. Decades-old murder under review. No names, no accusations, but everyone knew who lived on that street. Everyone knew who had always been there. The discomfort was palpable, the realization that familiarity could coexist with something far darker. Late one evening, as detectives prepared to leave, a lab result arrived that shifted the ground beneath them. A DNA profile, partial but viable, extracted from evidence once thought unusable. It wasn't enough to run through national databases, but it was enough to compare. When the comparison came back, it didn't scream certainty. It whispered probability, a statistical likelihood high enough to justify the next step, high enough to move from suspicion to action. They returned to the neighbor's house with a warrant. Swabs were taken. Items were cataloged. The man watched from his doorway, expression unreadable, as decades of routine were interrupted by procedure. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The moment itself spoke volumes. Days later, The results confirmed what instinct and inference had been circling for weeks. The match was not perfect, degraded by time, but it was strong. Strong enough to tell a story the neighbor had never told. Strong enough to suggest that the silence surrounding the murder had not been accidental. As the case edged closer to resolution, investigators felt the familiar tension between certainty and doubt. Cold cases rarely end cleanly. They fray at the edges. They leave questions unanswered. But this one was different. This one had momentum. And with each step forward, the town was forced to confront a possibility it had never fully allowed itself to consider. That the monster it feared had never come from outside at all. The anonymous caller never reached out again. Their voice faded back into whatever life it belonged to, leaving behind consequences that could no longer be undone. And as the pieces locked into place, one truth became impossible to ignore. The decades of silence had not been empty. They had been full of waiting. The warrant changed everything. It turned quiet suspicion into a formal march forward, and once that line was crossed, there was no retreat. Inside the department, the mood shifted from cautious curiosity to controlled urgency. Phones rang with purpose. Doors closed more often. The case stopped being spoken about in the past tense. It was no longer what had happened. It was what was happening. The DNA result, imperfect but persuasive, sat at the center of every conversation. Not a silver bullet, not the kind of clean match that makes headlines on its own, but enough to pull the case into a new gravity. Enough to justify pressure. Enough to justify belief. Investigators knew how defense attorneys would attack it, knew every weakness it carried, but they also knew something else. Combined with the timeline, the fibers, the shifting statements, the anonymous tip, it formed a constellation that pointed in only one direction. The neighbor felt it too. The change was visible. He stopped waving to people on his morning walks. He stayed inside more. Curtains that had been open for decades were suddenly drawn. When reporters began circling the street, he didn't step outside to complain or deny. He simply disappeared behind his front door, a man shrinking from a spotlight he had never expected to face. Detectives returned to the victim, not as a body, not as evidence, but as a person. They rebuilt her life piece by piece, understanding that motive often hides in the ordinary. She was known as reliable, predictable, someone whose routines were visible to anyone who cared to look. She walked the same routes, shopped at the same stores, spoke to the same neighbors. That predictability, once comforting, now felt dangerous in retrospect. Friends recalled moments that had seemed harmless at the time. A neighbor who lingered too long in conversation. Someone who offered help she hadn't asked for. Someone who knew when she'd be home before she ever said it out loud. These memories have been filed away as quirks, nothing more. Now they resurfaced, sharp and uncomfortable, stripped of innocence. The investigators leaned into behavioral analysis, mapping the crime not just as an act, but as a decision. The location suggested familiarity. The timing suggested planning. The lack of forced entry suggested trust, or at least the absence of fear. This wasn't random. It never had been. It was personal in a way the original investigation had been reluctant to accept. They confronted the neighbor again, this time with less patience. The interview room felt smaller than before, the air heavier. He sat in the same chair, but his posture was different, shoulders hunched, hands clasped tightly together as if holding something in place. The detectives didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. They laid out the facts slowly, deliberately, watching his reactions more than his words. They spoke of fibers, of timelines, of inconsistencies. They mentioned the DNA carefully without overstating it. And finally, they mentioned the anonymous tip. Not the voice, not the call itself, but the idea that someone had spoken after all these years. That someone had broken the silence. That was when the cracks widened. His breathing changed. He asked for water, then didn't drink it. He stared at the table longer than necessary, as if expecting it to speak first. When he finally responded, his voice was steady, but it lacked conviction. Denial delivered out of obligation rather than belief. He claimed persecution, claimed coincidence, claimed the department needed a win. The detectives let him talk, knowing that truth often hides in excess. He overexplained. He repeated himself. He contradicted earlier statements in subtle ways, shifting blame to memory, to age, to stress. Every word was recorded, every pause marked. Outside the room, prosecutors listened to the playback, weighing the risk. Cold cases are fragile in court. Jurors demand certainty, not probability. They demand clarity, not context. The question was whether the story they could tell was strong enough to survive scrutiny, whether justice delayed could still be justice delivered. As the legal teams debated, the town simmered. The idea that the case might finally be solved unsettled people more than the murder itself ever had. For decades, the crime had been an abstract tragedy, something safely distant, contained by time. Now it had a face, a location, a familiarity that felt like betrayal. People questioned their own memories, their own assumptions. They wondered how many times they had stood next to someone capable of violence and never known it. How many secrets a place could hold without showing signs of strain. The farming town, once defined by openness, began to close in on itself, suspicion seeping into everyday interactions. The victim's family was brought back into the process, carefully, respectfully. They were shown the evidence, the limitations, the possibilities. No promises were made. None could be. But for the first time in 40 years, they were being asked to prepare, not for disappointment, but for confrontation. The emotional weight was immense, a mix of hope and dread that settled heavily on their shoulders. Meanwhile, investigators chased the shadow of the anonymous caller. They re-examined phone records, explored voice analysis, considered everyone who might have known enough to make that call. The conclusion was unsettling. The caller could have been almost anyone. A neighbor, a friend, a relative, or the suspect himself, testing the waters, probing the system, seeing if the truth was finally ready to surface. That possibility lingered, uncomfortable and unprovable. But it added another layer to the psychological portrait taking shape. This was not a crime of passion alone. It was a crime followed by decades of silence, of control, of calculated normalcy. Whoever committed it had learned how to live alongside it, how to bury it beneath routine. When the decision came to move forward, it wasn't dramatic. No sadeneristas, no flashing lights, just paperwork, signatures, and a quiet understanding that the next step would change lives permanently. Charges were prepared, warrants reviewed. The machine of justice, slow and deliberate, began to turn. The arrest itself happened early in the morning, chosen deliberately to minimize spectacle. The neighbor opened his door to familiar faces, men he had spoken to calmly only weeks before. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging the end of a long, private chapter. As he was led away, the street remained silent, curtains trembling slightly as unseen eyes watched history unfold. News spread fast, faster than anyone expected. By noon, the town was buzzing, shock layered over disbelief. Headlines framed the story carefully, cautious language masking the gravity of the moment. A cold case, reopened. A suspect, charged. Words that carried the weight of decades. Inside the holding cell, the suspect sat alone, stripped of routine, stripped of control. Interrogators knew better than to push immediately. Tom had been his ally for 40 years. They were not about to rush now. They waited, allowing the reality to settle, allowing the silence to work in their favor. The first cracks appeared late that night. A request to speak. Not a confession. Not yet. Just questions. What evidence did they have? How strong was it? What would happen next? The detectives answered honestly, within limits, letting uncertainty do what accusation could not. Over the next days, the story tightened. Small admissions surfaced, framed as misunderstandings, as coincidences. He acknowledged being near the victim's home that night, a detail previously omitted. He admitted to knowing her schedule better than he had claimed. Each concession was minor, easily explained away on its own. Together, they formed a path leading somewhere inescapable. The case was no longer about whether something had happened. That question had been answered long ago. Now it was about ownership, about responsibility, about whether the truth would finally be spoken aloud, or whether it would remain trapped in implication and inference. As the town grappled with the arrest, another realization set in. Closure, if it came at all, would not be clean. It would not restore what had been lost. It would not erase the years of waiting, the birthdays missed, the questions unanswered. But it would do something else. It would break the spell of uncertainty that had lingered like a fog, dulling pain without ever lifting it. The cold case had been reopened. It had been re-examined. And now, standing on the edge of resolution, everyone involved understood the cost of waiting so long. Truth, when delayed, does not soften. It hardens. And when it finally emerges, it does not whisper. It resonates, shaking everything that has been built on silence. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a place designed to feel permanent, immovable, as if truth itself had been carved into the walls decades earlier and never updated. When the suspect was let in, the room did not gasp. It held its breath. Cameras clicked softly, restrained by rules and reverence, while the townspeople sat shoulder to shoulder, faces tight, eyes fixed on a man they thought they knew. He looked smaller than he had on the street. Not weak, not broken, just reduced by the weight of attention. For 40 years he had moved unnoticed, a familiar shape in a familiar place. Now every movement was scrutinized, every blink interpreted. The judge read the charges in a steady voice, words that traveled a long way to reach this moment. Murder, first degree, a date stamped in the early 1980s, a life frozen in ink. The prosecution did not rush. They understood the danger of haste. Cold cases demand patience, even at the point of revelation. They began not with the crime, but with the weight. 40 years of unanswered questions. 40 years of silence. They framed the case as a wound left untreated, festering beneath the surface of a town that believed it had healed. They spoke of evidence preserved by chance and stubbornness, of a blood-stained fabric sealed in an evidence locker and forgotten by everyone except time, of technology that did not exist when the crime was committed, now capable of listening to whispers trapped inside molecules. DNA, they said, does not forget. It waits. The defense countered with doubt, as expected. They spoke of degradation, of contamination, of the dangers of relying on science applied retroactively. They reminded the court that memory fades, that witnesses misremember, that time distorts even the most sincere recollections. They painted the investigation as desperate, a department eager to close a file regardless of the cost. Outside the courtroom, the town argued quietly. In diners and hardware stores, in church basements and parking lots, people weighed probability against belief. Some clung to the idea that a mistake had been made, that the man they had trusted could not possibly be capable of such violence. Others felt something darker settle into place, a recognition that comfort is not evidence of innocence. The victim's family sat together, hands clasped, listening to every word as if it were oxygen. They had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed reactions in private, but nothing prepared them for the reality of hearing their loved one reduced to exhibits and timelines. Still, there was relief in the formality. Relief that the story was finally being told in full sentences, not fragments and rumors. When witnesses took the stand, the past seeped into the present. Old neighbors described nights long gone, recalling sounds that had seemed unimportant then. A car door, a voice raised briefly, a light turning off earlier than usual. Each detail, insignificant alone, formed a mosaic of possibility. The jury listened carefully, aware that certainty was a luxury this case could not afford. The anonymous tip loomed over the proceedings like a ghost. The prosecution acknowledged it without revealing its source, careful not to overstate its role. The defense attacked it relentlessly, calling it unreliable, potentially malicious. They suggested it could have been motivated by revenge, jealousy, or boredom. The question of who had spoken up after all these years remained unanswered, a thread deliberately left loose. Behind the scenes, investigators continued to work. Cold cases rarely stop moving once they start. They rechecked alibis, re-interviewed witnesses, examined old photographs with new eyes. Every action carried the understanding that one overlooked detail could collapse the entire structure. The pressure was constant, but so was the resolve. The suspect, now defendant, remained mostly silent. His legal team advised restraint, and he followed it with disciplined calm. When he did speak, his words were measured, rehearsed, shaped by strategy rather than emotion. Observers noted the absence of outrage, the lack of visible shock. Some interpreted it as composure. Others saw something colder. As the trial progressed, the DNA evidence took center stage. Experts explained complex processes in plain language, translating science into narrative. They described how samples degrade, how profiles are built, how matches are evaluated statistically. They admitted limitations. They acknowledged uncertainty. And then they returned to the same conclusion. The probability of coincidence was vanishingly small. The defense responded with their own experts, challenging methodology, questioning lab procedures, introducing alternative explanations. The courtroom became a battleground of credentials and charts, a place where truth was argued in decimals and margins of error. Jurors scribbled notes, aware that their understanding would shape a verdict that echoed far beyond the room. Outside, media coverage intensified. National outlets descended on the town, drawn by the spectacle of time bending toward justice. Headlines spoke of closure, of breakthroughs, of reckoning. Residents bristled at the attention, protective of their grief, wary of being reduced to a cautionary tale. This was not entertainment. This was history still bleeding. The victim's name appeared everywhere, spoken aloud repeatedly for the first time in decades. It carried weight, reminding everyone that this case was not about systems or statistics, but about a person who had lived, planned, laughed, and then vanished violently from the world. Her absence had shaped the town as much as her life ever did. As closing arguments approached, tension tightened. The prosecution painted a picture of opportunity and familiarity, of trust exploited, of a crime hidden behind the camouflage of normalcy. They argued that the defendant's proximity was not coincidence, that his knowledge was not casual, that his silence was not innocence. They asked the jury to consider not just the evidence, but the story it told when allowed to speak fully. The defense urged caution. They warned against hindsight, against letting modern tools rewrite the past unfairly. They reminded the jury that doubt is not a flaw, but a safeguard. They framed the case as a tragic accumulation of assumptions, built on the shaky foundation of time-worn memories and imperfect science. When the jury was sent to deliberate, the courtroom emptied slowly, as if no one wanted to break the spell. The defendant was led away, expression unchanged. The victim's family remained seated, staring at the bench, unwilling to move forward without resolution. Deliberations stretched on. Hours turned into days. Each moment of silence amplified speculation. Was the jury divided? Stuck on the science? The timeline? The anonymous tip? Every possibility gnawed at those waiting. Cold cases do not resolve cleanly. They resist closure even when it is offered. Inside the jury room, the debate was intense but respectful. Some jurors focused on the DNA, seeing it as a voice from the past finally heard. Others struggled with the gaps, the missing pieces that time had swallowed. They revisited testimony, replayed arguments, weighed doubt against probability. The responsibility felt immense, the consequences irreversible. When the verdict finally came, the town seemed to pause collectively. People gathered around televisions and radios, hearts pounding in unison. The courtroom filled again, heavier than before. The defendant stood. The jury foreperson's hands trembled slightly as the envelope was opened. The words landed with a force that rippled outward. Guilty. A verdict that did not end the story, but changed its direction irrevocably. The victim's family wept quietly, a release decades overdue. The defendant's face remained still, a mask hardened by years of practice. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. The legal process, like time itself, would continue forward relentlessly. But something fundamental had shifted. The cold case was no longer a question mark. It was a statement, etched into public record. In the days that followed, the town began the slow work of reckoning. Some felt vindicated. Others mourned not just the victim, but the loss of innocence that accompanied the realization that evil can wear familiar faces. Conversations grew more honest, more cautious. Trust, once automatic, now required proof. The anonymous tip remained anonymous. Perhaps it always would. Its purpose, some argued, was fulfilled the moment it broke the silence. Others wondered if the caller listened to the verdict with satisfaction or regret, knowing they had tipped the first domino. For investigators, the case closed quietly. Files were archived with care, marked resolved but never forgotten. They knew that justice, even when delivered, carries weight. It does not celebrate. It acknowledges. And for the victim, whose life had been paused in the public imagination for 40 years, there was finally movement. Not resurrection, not repair, but recognition. A truth spoken aloud, heard, and recorded. The cold case had been solved, but its echo lingered. In the creak of courtroom benches, in the hushed tones of neighbors passing on the street, in the understanding that time does not erase crimes. It only waits, patient and unyielding, until someone dares to listen closely enough to hear what it has been holding all along. The sentence was handed down on a gray morning, the kind of overcast sky that flattens sound and color, as if the world itself had decided not to react too loudly. The judge's voice carried across the courtroom with practiced gravity, every word deliberate, every pause heavy with consequence. Decades had passed since the crime, yet the punishment arrived with undiminished force, landing not only on the man standing before the bench, but on everyone who had lived alongside the unanswered question for so long. Life without parole. The phrase settled into the room like dust, invisible but impossible to ignore. For the victim's family, it was not triumph. It was an ending that arrived too late to feel complete. Justice does not rewind time. It does not return stolen years. It simply draws a line, marking where silence must finally stop. The defendant was led away once more, this time not as a suspect or an accused man, but as a convicted murderer. The transformation was subtle, yet absolute. In the hallway outside the courtroom, reporters waited, microphones raised, voices overlapping. The questions came fast. How do you feel? Do you believe justice was served? What happens now? The family answered none of them. Some things cannot be reduced to sound bites. Inside the courthouse, investigators gathered briefly, exchanging looks that carried exhaustion rather than satisfaction. They had done what many believed impossible. They had reopened a wound and forced it to heal properly, painfully, honestly. But the cost was visible. Cold cases do not resolve cleanly. They leave scars on everyone who touches them. In the days following the verdict, the town shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight. Change came in small, almost imperceptible ways. Conversations paused when the defendant's name surfaced. People reevaluated memories, replaying past interactions through a new lens. That smile at the grocery store, that wave from across the street. Innocent moments now carried an edge of unease. Local businesses noticed it first. The cafe where the defendant used to sit every morning left his usual chair empty, unsure whether to move it or let it fade naturally. The hardware store removed his photo from a community board, doing so quietly, without announcement. These were not acts of condemnation, but of recalibration. The town was learning how to live with a truth it had never expected. For the victim's family, the aftermath was strangely disorienting. For years, their lives had revolved around absence and uncertainty. Every phone call had carried the possibility of new information. Every anniversary reopened the same wound. Now, the waiting was over, and the silence that followed felt unfamiliar. Closure, they discovered, is not a door that slams shut. It is a hallway that keeps going. They visited the grave together, standing in a loose circle, speaking softly. They talked about the trial, about the verdict, about things that had gone unsaid for decades. They also talked about ordinary things: work, weather, children. Life had continued, even when justice had stalled, acknowledging that felt like both betrayal and relief. Meanwhile, the case continued to ripple outward. Law enforcement agencies across the state reviewed their own cold files, inspired and unsettled by the outcome. Evidence lockers were reopened. Old boxes were dusted off. Detectives who had inherited unsolved cases felt a renewed pressure, but also a renewed sense of possibility. If this case could be solved, perhaps others could too. The role of the anonymous tip became a point of fascination. Journalists speculated endlessly about the caller's identity. Was it a friend? A relative? A conscience awakened by time? Investigators refused to comment, maintaining the promise of confidentiality. Some truths, they understood, only surface when protected by shadows. The defendant filed an appeal, as expected. His legal team argued procedural errors, challenged evidentiary rulings, questioned the interpretation of DNA results. The process moved slowly, methodically, grinding forward through motions and responses. For the victim's family, it was a reminder that even after a verdict, the system never truly rests. Public opinion fractured along familiar lines. Some hailed the case as a triumph of modern forensics, proof that no crime is beyond reach. Others warned of the dangers of over-reliance on technology, of the risk of convicting based on evidence gathered decades after the fact. Talk radio buzzed with debate. Editorials filled local papers. The case had become more than a crime. It was a symbol. At the center of it all was the simple, brutal fact of what had happened in 1982. A life taken, a future erased. No amount of legal discourse could soften that reality. The victim's story, once fragmented and incomplete, now stood whole, though still tragic. She was remembered not just as a case number, but as a person whose death had demanded accountability across generations. Investigators returned to their routines, but the case lingered in their minds. Some admitted to dreaming about it, replaying moments from the trial, imagining alternative outcomes. Others found themselves more meticulous, more cautious, aware that today's overlooked detail could become tomorrow's cold case. The evidence that had sealed the conviction was returned to storage, this time marked clearly, definitively. It would not be forgotten again. It had spoken, finally, after decades of waiting, and its voice had changed everything. In the town, a memorial was quietly updated. The victim's name, already present, was joined by a small plaque noting the year the case was solved. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just a simple acknowledgement that the story had reached a turning point. People paused there occasionally, reading the words, absorbing their weight. Children who had grown up hearing whispers about the unsolved murder now heard a different version of the story, one with an ending. Parents explained it carefully, emphasizing patience, truth, and the idea that justice, while slow, can arrive. The lesson was not comforting, but it was real. As months passed, the intensity faded, replaced by a quieter reflection. The town did not celebrate the conviction. It integrated it. Like a scar, it became part of the collective identity, a reminder of vulnerability and resilience intertwined. For the victim's family, healing remained uneven. Some days felt lighter. Others were heavy with memories newly sharpened by the trial. They learned that grief does not disappear when answers arrive. It changes shape. It becomes less chaotic, but no less profound. The anonymous tipster never came forward publicly. Perhaps they never would. Their role remained a footnote in official records, a catalyst without a face. In some ways, that anonymity felt appropriate. The case had never been about recognition. It had been about truth. Years from now, the story would be retold in documentaries and podcasts, distilled into timelines and narrations. Listeners would marvel at the persistence, the science, the breakthrough. But those who lived through it knew the deeper reality. Cold cases are not puzzles waiting to be solved. Their lives paused, communities suspended, justice deferred but not denied. The Ohio 1982 cold case was no longer unsolved, but its impact did not end with a verdict. It continued in the cautious trust of neighbors, in the diligence of investigators, in the quiet determination of families who refused to let silence win. Tom had tried to bury the truth. It had nearly succeeded, but in the end, it was time itself that betrayed the lie, preserving just enough evidence, just enough memory, for the past to speak when someone finally listened. And even now, long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, the story remained a warning and a promise. A warning that crimes do not vanish simply because years pass, and a promise that even the coldest cases can still burn, waiting patiently for the moment when justice, slow and unrelenting, finally catches up. The appeal moved through the system like a shadow, quiet but persistent, reminding everyone that even a solved cold case never truly rests. Paperwork replaced courtroom drama. Briefs were filed, arguments sharpened, language dissected word by word. There are no cameras this time, no crowded benches, no gasps from the gallery. Justice, in this phase, was procedural and cold, mirroring the years the case itself had spent buried. For the victim's family, the appeal reopened a familiar tension. Not fear that the truth would vanish again, but exhaustion at the idea of reliving it. Every motion felt like a hand reaching backward, tugging at scars that had barely begun to close. They followed updates cautiously, learning to read legal language the way others read weather reports, scanning for signs of storms. The defense argued memory contamination, chain of custody gaps, the unreliability of witnesses recalling events from decades earlier. They questioned whether time itself had altered the evidence, whether modern interpretation had reshaped the past. It was a familiar strategy, but hearing it still felt like an attempt to rewind reality, to dissolve certainty back into doubt. Prosecutors responded with restraint. They did not dramatize. They did not re-argue the entire case. They pointed to documentation, to preserved protocols, to the quiet consistency of facts that had survived 40 years of neglect and scrutiny. This was not about emotion. It was about endurance. The truth had outlasted denial. Outside the legal arena, life continued. But the case had altered how people perceived time. Ordinary events now carried a strange duality. A child's graduation, a retirement party, a wedding anniversary. All were reminders that while life moves relentlessly forward, unresolved violence lingers, suspended between past and present. In the town, a local historian began compiling an archive. Newspaper clippings, court transcripts, interview recordings, not for sensationalism, but for record. The goal was preservation, an acknowledgement that forgetting had nearly allowed a murderer to live out his life unaccountable. Memory, the historian believed, was a form of protection. Detectives who had worked the reopened investigation spoke privately about its toll. Some admitted it had changed how they approached newer cases. They documented more carefully. They questioned assumptions more aggressively. They treated every piece of evidence as if it might someday be all that remained. The past had taught them how fragile certainty could be. The anonymous tip still hovered over everything, an unseen hinge on which history had turned. Investigators revisited the call internally, replaying it, analyzing tone, pacing, word choice. They debated whether the voice had sounded relieved or fearful, determined or hesitant. There was no conclusion, only speculation. The tip had done its job and vanished. As months turned into a year, the appeal was denied. The ruling arrived without fanfare, a written decision uploaded quietly, confirming that the conviction would stand. No press conference followed, no breaking news banners. But for those involved, the impact was immediate and profound. The line that had been drawn was now permanent. The family received the news at home. Some cried, some sat in silence. One member simply nodded, as if acknowledging something long expected. There was no celebration, only a settling, like dust after a long disturbance. The legal fight was over. The truth, at least in the eyes of the law, was secure. The defendant was transferred to a different facility, farther from the town, farther from the life he had once blended into so easily. His name began to fade from daily conversation. Not erased, but no longer central. Attention shifted slowly toward what came next. What comes after justice is rarely discussed. There is no manual for it. The family sought counseling, individually and together, discovering that closure is not an event but a process, uneven and unpredictable. Some days felt lighter. Others were unexpectedly heavy, triggered by sounds, smells, passing remarks. The community grappled with its own reckoning. How they missed it. How many signs had gone unnoticed, dismissed, rationalized? Public forums were held, framed as discussions about safety and awareness. But beneath them lay a deeper unease. Trust, once fractured, does not automatically repair. Teachers incorporated the case into lessons about critical thinking and civic responsibility. Not the violence itself, but the timeline, the delays, the consequences of silence. Students asked difficult questions. Could it happen again? Does justice always take this long? The answers were honest and unsettling. The case began to appear in academic journals, cited in discussions about cold case methodology, DNA preservation, and the ethics of delayed prosecution. Scholars debated its implications, analyzing it from a distance. For them, it was data. For the town, it was memory. Investigators received letters from other families with unsolved cases, some hopeful, some desperate. They could not respond to all of them. They did what they could, offering guidance, sharing resources, but always careful not to promise what might not be possible. Not every cold case has evidence waiting to speak. At night, some detectives still thought about the early years of the investigation, the missteps, the misconnections. They wondered how different everything might have been if technology had arrived sooner, if procedures had been tighter, if someone had spoken up earlier. These thoughts had no answers, only lessons. The victim's name was spoken more often now, not as part of speculation, but as part of remembrance. Her story was told with clarity, her life described in fuller terms. She was no longer defined solely by her death. That, perhaps, was the most meaningful change. Years passed. The headlines disappeared entirely. New stories took their place. New crimes. New mysteries. But the Ohio 1982 cold case remained quietly influential, shaping policy discussions, training programs, and investigative priorities. Its legacy was subtle but enduring. On an anniversary of the conviction, the family gathered again, this time not at a grave, but at a small park. They shared stories, laughed briefly, cried briefly, and acknowledged how far they had come. The pain was still there, but it no longer consumed every moment. The anonymous tipster remained unknown. Sometimes that absence felt frustrating. Other times it felt symbolic. The case had been solved not by a single hero, but by accumulation. Time, science, persistence, a voice from the dark. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time. But this one proved that time does not only erode, it can also preserve. It can hold truth in suspension until the world is ready or capable of seeing it clearly. As the town moved forward, it carried the story with it, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Justice may be delayed. Silence may dominate. But the past is never as quiet as it seems. It waits. It listens. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, it speaks with undeniable force. The Ohio 1982 cold case was solved, upheld, and settled in law. Yet its echo remained low and steady, a reminder that some stories refuse to stay buried, and that even after decades, the truth can still rise, sharp and undeniable, demanding to be heard. The prison intake officer read the name again, slower this time, as if the syllables carried weight beyond ink and paper. 40 years earlier, the name had moved freely through the town, spoken casually at cookouts, printed on donation plaques, signed at the bottom of holiday cards. Now it was reduced to a number, stitched on a fabric, logged into a system built to contain what had once slipped unnoticed through everyday life. The transformation was complete, yet it felt strangely unfinished. Inside the facility, routine took over. Count times. Lights out. Meals slid through slots. The man at the center of the Ohio 1982 cold case learned quickly that notoriety fades fast behind concrete walls. Other inmates did not care about headlines from decades ago. There was no shock left to absorb. Only time, stretching long and thin, indifferent to guilt or innocence. But outside, the case continued to ripple. A documentary crew arrived quietly, not with the urgency of breaking news, but with the patience of people who knew the story would speak for itself. They interviewed detectives in neutral rooms, filmed old evidence boxes being opened with careful hands, panned slowly across streets that looked almost too normal to have held such secrets. The town watched from a distance, wary of exploitation, but aware that silence had once been part of the problem. The family was asked to participate. They debated it privately, weighing the risk of reopening wounds against the possibility of ensuring the truth was not distorted. In the end, they agreed on their terms. No reenactments, no dramatized violence, just facts, memory, and the cost of waiting. As cameras rolled, one family member described the first night after the disappearance. The way the house felt wrong without her voice, the way every sound outside had seemed like it might be her returning. The words were measured, controlled, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. This was not history. It was lived experience carried forward day by day. The documentary reignited conversations that had gone quiet. Viewers across the state recognized parallels to their own unresolved cases. Tip lines lit up briefly, not with new information about this crime, but with questions about others. Could old evidence still matter? Could forgotten details still be useful? The answer, increasingly, was yes. Law enforcement agencies took note. Training seminars referenced the Ohio case explicitly, emphasizing the value of revisiting assumptions, of re-examining evidence without the bias of original conclusions. The phrase cold case began to lose some of its finality. Cold did not mean dead. It meant waiting. The anonymous tip remained the most haunting element. Online forums speculated endlessly. Some believed it came from a family member of the convicted man, burdened by knowledge too heavy to carry any longer. Others suspected a former co-worker or someone who had witnessed something small and strange in 1982 and only decades later understood its meaning. The truth, locked inside an unknown conscience, stayed out of reach. The convicted man's appeals options narrowed. Legal advisors shifted from strategy to inevitability. There were no more procedural doors to knock on, only time to serve. In rare interviews, he maintained a flat insistence on being misunderstood, never fully denying, never fully confessing. His words were careful, calculated, as if ambiguity itself were a shield. Psychologists debated that ambiguity publicly. Was it self-delusion, a coping mechanism, or simply the final form of control, withholding clarity even after conviction? The discussions were academic, distant, but they underscored a central discomfort. Answers do not always come packaged with remorse. For the town, the case became a reference point. Before and after, people spoke of it the way others speak of natural disasters, something that reshaped awareness, altered behavior. Parents walked children home a little longer than before. Neighbors paid closer attention to routines, to absences, to inconsistencies that once might have been dismissed as none of their business. At the local library, circulation records showed a spike in true crime books, particularly those focused on unsolved cases. Readers were not seeking thrills. They were searching for patterns, for understanding, for reassurance that chaos could be organized into something resembling sense. The victim's name appeared in a scholarship fund established quietly by the family, focused on criminal justice studies. It was not about honoring the system, but improving it, about ensuring future investigators had better tools, better training, fewer blind spots. The fund description was brief, almost understated, but its intent was clear. Time continued to pass, as it always does, indifferent to narrative arcs. Seasons changed. New faces moved into town. Some residents who had lived through 1982 passed away, taking their memories with them. Others, younger, inherited the story secondhand, learning it as part of local lore, filtered through lessons and cautionary tones. The documentary aired to strong response. Viewers praised its restraint, its refusal to sensationalize. Critics noted its most powerful moments were the quiet ones. A long shot of an empty road at dusk, a detective pausing before answering a question, a family member closing their eyes as if bracing against a memory. Silence, it turned out, could be more revealing than narration. In the wake of the broadcast, the family received letters. Some were clumsy, awkward attempts at sympathy. Others were thoughtful, deeply personal messages from strangers who had lost someone and never found answers. The family read many of them, responded to a few, and kept others as reminders that their story was part of a much larger, unfinished map of loss. The cold case unit that had reopened the investigation disbanded, its work complete. Members returned to other assignments, but the experience lingered. One detective admitted privately that the case had changed his sense of urgency. "Every delay matters," he said. "You don't always see it right away, but it does." The evidence, now fully processed and cataloged, was stored again, this time with finality. Labels were updated. Notes were complete. There would be no need to reopen these boxes again. The truth they contained had been extracted, tested, and accepted. And yet, closure remained elusive in subtle ways. On certain nights, the family still dreamed of alternative endings, of different choices made by different people, of a timeline where the anonymous tip came sooner, where technology advanced faster, where someone spoke when it mattered most. These dreams were not regrets so much as reflections, the mind's way of exploring paths no longer available. Public interest gradually waned, as it always does. The story receded from headlines, from trending lists, from conversation. But unlike before, it did not vanish entirely. It settled into a quieter place, one of understanding rather than speculation. The Ohio 1982 cold case had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a question mark. It was an answer, however imperfect, however delayed. That distinction mattered. In the end, what lingered most was not the crime itself, but the lesson it left behind. That time can hide truth, but can also preserve it. That silence can protect wrongdoing, but can also be broken, even decades later, by a single decision to speak. Somewhere, the anonymous tipster lived on, anonymous still, perhaps lighter, perhaps not. Their voice had altered history without ever stepping into the light. In a story filled with evidence and procedure, that small human act remained the most mysterious element of all. And as the town continued forward, carrying both memory and distance, one thing became clear. The case had ended, but its echo had not. It would continue to shape how people listened, how they noticed, how they understood that even the quietest past can one day demand to be heard. Years after the verdict, the case still lived in fragments, resurfacing in unexpected places, slipping into conversations where it was not invited. It appeared in classrooms when professors spoke about the limits of certainty, in police briefings when supervisors warned against tunnel vision, in late-night radio shows where callers asked whether justice delayed could ever feel complete. The Ohio 1982 cold case was no longer a headline, but it was not silent either. It had become a reference, a warning, a shadow that refused to fade entirely. Inside the prison walls, the man convicted of the murder aged quickly, hair thinned, shoulders rounded. The confidence he once carried like a tailored coat dissolved into something smaller, tighter, as if even his posture was learning to conserve space. He filed paperwork, requested library access, attended mandatory programs. The routine was numbing, designed not to punish but to contain. And containment, over time, has a way of stripping away performance. Guards observed him carefully in the first months, curious about the man whose name they had heard on the news. Later, he became just another inmate, another face in the line, another set of movements to log and forget. Fame, even infamy, has a short shelf life behind bars. What remains is time, unbroken and indifferent. Occasionally, he spoke about the past in vague terms, never specifics. He talked about the town, about how small it felt now in his memory, about how people misunderstand what they think they know. He avoided the word murder, avoided the victim's name. Language was still his last refuge, a place where he could blur edges, soften facts, rearrange meaning. Those listening learned quickly to separate what was said from what was not. Outside, the family continued navigating a world that expected them to feel finished. Strangers assumed the conviction had closed a chapter. That grief followed a neat arc toward resolution. But grief does not obey verdicts. It shifts, changes shape, finds new expressions. Relief mingled with exhaustion. Anger gave way to something quieter, heavier. There was no celebration, only a steady exhale that had been held for 40 years. They visited the grave more often now, not because it was new, but because it finally felt like a place where truth had arrived. They spoke aloud sometimes, not to recount details, but to acknowledge time lost, moments stolen. They did not ask questions anymore. The answers, such as they were, had already been given. The town itself struggled with memory. New residents heard the stories secondhand, filtered through years of retelling. Some details sharpened, others blurred. The essentials remained: a disappearance, decades of uncertainty, a late-breaking tip that changed everything. But the emotional weight was harder to transmit. Those who had lived through it carried a different understanding, one shaped by nights spent waiting for news that never came. Local officials debated whether to erect a memorial. Some argued it would reopen wounds. Others believed it would anchor the story in a physical space, preventing it from dissolving into rumor. In the end, they chose something modest, a small plaque near the community center, engraved with a name, a date, and a simple line about remembrance. No mention of the crime, no details, just acknowledgement. True crime podcasts circled the case repeatedly, each promising a new angle. Some were thoughtful, careful with facts. Others leaned into speculation, resurrecting theories long disproven. The family learned to avoid them, aware that attention could be both validating and corrosive. The story was theirs, but it no longer belonged solely to them. That loss of control was another price of resolution. In law enforcement circles, the case continued to be studied, not for its drama, but for its delay. Analysts dissected early missteps, identified moments where bias had narrowed focus, where assumptions had closed doors. They emphasized the importance of evidence preservation, of resisting the urge to declare a case unsolvable. The cold case became a teaching tool, stripped of names, reduced to process. One detective, now retired, admitted privately that the case haunted him less for what he had done wrong than for what he had not done at all. "We didn't look again," he said. "We didn't question ourselves enough." It was not an admission of guilt, but of humanity. The acknowledgement that systems are only as good as the people running them, and people are fallible. The anonymous tip remained unresolved, its origin unknown. Investigators had tried to trace it, following technical paths that led nowhere. The caller had been careful, deliberate, aware of how to disappear even as they spoke. Some speculated the tipster had since died, taking their full story with them. Others believed anonymity was intentional, a way to act without consequence, to unburden without exposure. Psychologists debated the motive endlessly. Was it guilt? Fear? A moment of clarity late in life? Theories multiplied, none provable. In a case built on evidence finally surfacing, the tip itself remained an enigma, a reminder that not all truth leaves fingerprints. As years passed, the legal finality settled. Appeals exhausted. Sentencing complete. The case file closed with an official stamp that felt both decisive and inadequate. Closure, it turned out, was not a single moment, but a gradual adjustment, a recalibration of expectations. The family no longer waited for answers. They learned to live with what they had. The town changed. Businesses closed and opened. Streets were repaved. Children who had not been born in 1982 grew up hearing the story as history, not lived experience. To them, the cold case was a lesson, not a wound. That shift was subtle but significant, marking the slow passage from trauma to memory. Yet on certain anniversaries, the past pressed closer. News outlets revisited the case with updates framed as reflections. Social media posts resurfaced old photos, black and white images of a woman smiling, frozen in a time before everything went wrong. Comments filled with shock from those just discovering the story, and quiet nods from those who never forgot. The convicted man watched some of this from afar, through filtered access, through conversations with others who still followed the news. He rarely reacted publicly. When he did, it was with a detachment that unsettled observers. Whether it was resignation or denial was impossible to say. Inside, he remained a question mark, even to himself. For the family, healing became less about the case and more about reclaiming space. Space to talk about her without mentioning how she died. Space to remember her laughter, her habits, the small details that had been overshadowed by tragedy. They learned that justice, while necessary, was not sufficient. It addressed the crime, not the absence. Community forums occasionally invited them to speak, to share their experience. Sometimes they accepted, other times they declined. When they did speak, they avoided drama. They spoke about patience, about persistence, about the importance of speaking up even when it feels too late. Their words carried weight precisely because they were measured. The Ohio 1982 cold case had become a paradox. Solved, yet unfinished. Closed, yet still teaching. It had delivered accountability, but left behind questions that could not be answered by any court. Why did it take so long? Why did no one speak sooner? Why did one voice, anonymous and delayed, make all the difference? These questions lingered not as accusations, but as reminders. Reminders that silence is not neutral. That time does not erase truth, only delays its impact. That justice, when it arrives late, still matters, but carries scars of its own. And so the story continued, not as a breaking headline, not as a mystery, but as an echo of a life interrupted, of decades spent waiting, of a community learning, slowly, that even the coldest case can still burn. Long after the cameras packed up and the courthouse returned to its ordinary rhythm, the case kept breathing in quiet corners, places where time moved slower and memory refused to thin. It lived in file rooms where cardboard boxes sagged under their own weight, in notebooks detectives never threw away, in the uneasy pause that followed whenever someone mentioned the year 1982 out loud. The Ohio cold case had been solved, yes, but solved things do not simply vanish. They settle, they seep, they change the ground beneath them. In the police department, a younger generation took over desks once occupied by men who had chased leads on rotary phones and handwritten notes. These new officers grew up with databases, DNA kits, instant cross-state communication. To them, the idea that a murder could sit unresolved for decades felt almost impossible, a relic of another era. And yet, the case was taught deliberately, methodically, as proof that technology does not replace judgment and speed does not guarantee truth. In training sessions, instructors spoke about the anonymous tip with reverence and discomfort. Reverence because it cracked the case. Discomfort because it raised an unsettling question. How many other cases were waiting on a voice that never came? How many people knew something and chose silence, telling themselves it was not their place, not their problem, not worth the risk? That question lingered like a low hum in every discussion. Silence was no longer treated as absence. It was treated as a factor. The family noticed a shift in how people spoke to them. Early on, conversations were heavy with apologies, with careful phrasing, with the fear of saying the wrong thing. Later, they became more open, more reflective. Strangers approached not just to express sympathy, but to confess. Small things, things they had seen, things they had ignored. None of it changed the outcome, but it changed the atmosphere. The family realized the case had given others permission to speak, even belatedly. They carried those confessions quietly, understanding that guilt looks for release in many forms. They did not judge. They had learned that judgment was easy from the outside, unbearable from within. The convicted man's appeals wound their way through the system with the predictability of procedure. Legal arguments dissected the anonymous tip, the handling of evidence, the interpretation of testimony. Each filing reopened the narrative briefly, forcing the family to revisit details they had worked hard to place behind them. The courts, however, remained firm. The evidence held. The conviction stood. Still, the process underscored a truth that no verdict could erase. Justice is not a moment. It is maintenance. It requires constant reaffirmation, constant defense against erosion. The system did its job, but only after being pushed, questioned, and forced to look backward as much as forward. Media interest spiked again during one appeal hearing, then faded. Headlines shortened. The language softened. What was once shocking became notable, then simply referenced. The story transitioned from breaking news to archive content, searchable but no longer urgent. This, too, was a kind of closure, though not one the family had ever requested. In the town, people debated whether the case had changed them or merely revealed what had always been there. Some believed the long unsolved murder had instilled caution, a quiet wariness that shaped how neighbors interacted. Others argued the opposite, that the resolution restored a sense of trust, proving that truth could surface even after decades underground. The answer depended on who you asked and when. At the local diner, older patrons still remembered the days when fear crept into routine, when parents double-checked locks and teenagers were warned not to walk alone. Younger patrons listened with curiosity, unable to fully grasp a time when information moved slowly, when rumors filled gaps left by official silence. The same story, told across generations, sounded like two different events. The plaque near the community center weathered its first winters, snow gathering at its base, sunlight bleaching its edges. People paused there sometimes, reading the inscription more than once, as if expecting it to say more. Some left flowers. Others left nothing but thought. The simplicity of it was intentional. It refused spectacle. It demanded reflection. The family visited less frequently now, not because it mattered less, but because they no longer needed to prove remembrance. Memory had found a stable place. It no longer surged unpredictably. It existed alongside daily life, integrated rather than intrusive. One sibling admitted, quietly, that they had stopped dreaming about the case. For years, sleep had been crowded with images they did not choose. Now, dreams returned to ordinary things, conversations, places, moments unconnected to loss. It felt like betrayal at first, then relief. Healing, they learned, often feels wrong before it feels right. The convicted man continued aging in a way no courtroom ever records. Birthdays passed without ceremony. Seasons marked by changes in light through barred windows. He watched men arrive and leave, some freed, some transferred, some carried out on stretchers. Prison time compresses life into repetition, erasing milestones until only endurance remains. Whether he felt remorse was a question endlessly speculated upon, rarely answered. Those closest to him inside said he spoke more about regret than innocence now. But regret is a broad word. It can mean sorrow for harm done or sorrow for consequences suffered. The distinction mattered to outsiders. Inside, it mattered less. Accountability had already been assigned. The anonymous tip continued to haunt investigators in a different way, not as a mystery to solve, but as a phenomenon to understand. Departments across the state reviewed their tip lines, their anonymity policies, their follow-up procedures. They asked how to encourage information without relying on chance, how to make silence harder than speech. Workshops were held, campaigns launched, slogans crafted, but everyone understood the limitation. You cannot force conscience. You can only make space for it when it arrives. In universities, criminology, students wrote papers about the case, analyzing it from angles never intended by those who lived it. They charted timelines, mapped decision points, debated ethics. For them, the case was material. For the family, it remained life. This disconnect was not offensive, just inevitable. Stories change meaning as they move away from their source. One professor invited a family member to speak to a class. The room was quiet as they described the waiting, the uncertainty, the moment the phone rang decades later. No theory could replicate that. No chart could capture the sound of a voice delivering long-delayed truth. The students listened differently after that, aware that every case file represented people still breathing, still remembering. As the years continued, anniversaries became softer markers. They no longer triggered public statements or interviews. They passed quietly, noted privately. The family learned that they did not owe the world continued access to their pain. They had given enough. The Ohio 1982 cold case settled into its final form. Not a mystery, not a scandal, but a testament. A testament to time's ability to conceal and reveal. To the cost of silence. To the endurance of those who wait without knowing if waiting will ever end. And beneath all of it, a steady truth remained. Justice had arrived, imperfect and late, but real. It did not restore what was lost. It did not answer every question, but it drew a line through uncertainty, replacing it with something solid enough to stand on. The echo was quieter now, but it was still there. A reminder that even when a case is solved, its impact continues, shaping lives in ways no verdict can fully contain. Time did what it always does after the noise fades. It reorganized priorities. It softened edges. It pulled attention elsewhere. But in Ohio, the solved cold case never fully left the room. It became a reference point, invoked quietly when new disappearances were reported, when evidence went missing, when someone hesitated before calling in a tip. It was no longer the headline. It was the footnote everyone read twice. The detectives who had closed the case carried it differently now. In the early months after the conviction, there had been adrenaline, interviews, conferences, a brief moment where decades of doubt gave way to certainty. Then came the long exhale. Paperwork, retirement forms, the slow realization that solving a case does not restore time. It only clarifies what time has already taken. One investigator, now gray-haired and deliberate in his movements, kept a copy of the original case photo in his desk drawer. He did not look at it often. He did not need to. Its presence mattered more than its image. A reminder that persistence is not heroic in the moment. It is tedious. It is lonely. It is often invisible. When asked why he never threw it away, he said the answer was simple. Because forgetting is easier than learning. In the town, new families moved into old houses. Children rode bikes down streets, once patrolled by volunteers during the height of fear. They laughed without knowing why older residents sometimes watched them longer than necessary. Safety, once fractured, had been slowly rebuilt, plank by plank, until it resembled something like trust again. But trust, unlike innocence, remembers its fractures. At community meetings, the case surfaced indirectly. Discussions about lighting, about neighborhood watch programs, about school safety drills. No one needed to say the year. Everyone knew. The past had become shorthand, a shared reference that required no explanation. The family found themselves in a strange position as time passed. They were no longer actively grieving in a way people recognize. The sharpness had dulled. The urgency had softened. Yet the loss remained structurally present, like a missing beam in a house that still stands but never quite settles. They learned that grief does not move forward in a straight line. It circles. It revisits. It waits patiently for moments of quiet before resurfacing. Anniversaries were manageable. Ordinary days were harder. A song on the radio, a passing comment, a familiar scent. Memory does not announce itself. It intrudes. One family member began writing, not for publication, not for therapy, but for order. Pages filled with fragments. Questions never asked. Thoughts never voiced. It was not a search for answers. It was an attempt to document endurance. To leave proof that the waiting had happened, that it had been real, that it had mattered. They never showed those pages to anyone. The anonymous tipster remained anonymous. Over time, theories hardened into assumptions. Some believed it had been a family member of the convicted man, burdened by years of proximity to guilt. Others suspected an old acquaintance, someone whose conscience matured slower than their fear. Law enforcement stopped speculating publicly. The identity no longer mattered. The impact did. Yet privately, investigators admitted the uncertainty unsettled them. Closure built on anonymity felt incomplete, like a book missing its final paragraph. It challenged the narrative instinct that demands every question be answered. This case refused that demand. It insisted on ambiguity, even in resolution. That insistence changed how the case was taught. It was no longer framed as a triumph alone, but as a caution, a lesson in humility, proof that justice can arrive without clarity, and that clarity is not always justice. Across the state, cold case units saw increased funding, increased scrutiny. Administrators pointed to Ohio as evidence that investment mattered. Skeptics countered that it was luck, timing, coincidence. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in between. Resources create opportunity. Opportunity still requires a spark. The spark, in this case, had been a phone call with no return number. Years later, a journalist attempted to reopen the narrative, pitching a long-form investigation into the tipster's identity. The family declined to participate. Law enforcement declined to comment. The story stalled, not because it lacked intrigue, but because it lacked permission. Some stories, once settled, resist excavation. The journalist moved on. The silence held. The convicted man's health began to fail. This fact surfaced briefly in court documents and local updates, then disappeared again. The family was notified as a matter of procedure. The notification landed with surprising neutrality. There was no surge of emotion, no sense of reckoning, just information. Time had already done its work. The question of forgiveness surfaced occasionally, usually from outsiders. It was asked carefully, as if the right phrasing might unlock something profound. The family learned to answer honestly and briefly. Forgiveness, they said, was not a destination. It was not owed. It was not denied. It was irrelevant to justice. This answer confused people. It disappointed some. It relieved others. The family stopped adjusting it for comfort. In academic circles, the case continued to appear in footnotes and lectures. It became an example of delayed justice, of the evolving role of public participation in investigations, of the ethical complexity surrounding anonymous information. Students debated whether anonymity should be protected at all costs or challenged in the name of accountability. The case provided no clear resolution. It simply existed, defiant and instructive. One former juror wrote a letter years after the trial, addressed to the family, but never sent. In it, they described the weight of deliberation, the silence of the jury room, the moment consensus was reached. They described walking out of the courthouse in a sunlight that felt undeserved. The letter ended without a conclusion, folded into a drawer, another private artifact of public justice. As seasons turned, the town's relationship with the case continued to evolve. It was no longer whispered. It was referenced plainly. Children learned about it in school, not as a cautionary tale, but as a historical one. Something that happened before they were born. Something finished. Finished, but not forgotten. The plaque near the community center was cleaned regularly now, less out of ceremony than habit. It had become part of the landscape, like a bench or a tree. People sat near it without always reading it. Presence does not require attention to matter. On one quiet afternoon, an elderly resident paused there longer than usual. They had lived through the original investigation, the rumors, the fear. They had suspected someone once, never spoken up, never acted. Standing there now, decades later, they felt no urge to confess. Only a distant, muted regret. Tom had made judgment irrelevant. Consequence had already occurred. This, too, was part of the case's legacy. Not confession, not absolution, just reflection. The Ohio 1982 cold case had reached a strange equilibrium. It no longer demanded answers. It no longer provoked outrage. It had settled into the collective consciousness as something that had tested patience and proved endurance. A story without embellishment. A truth without triumph. And still, beneath the calm, a current remained. A reminder that silence can be powerful, that time can be deceptive, that justice does not announce itself with certainty. It arrives quietly, often incomplete, shaped by human choice and human delay. As years continued to pass, the case's most enduring impact became clear. It was not the conviction. It was not the headlines. It was the shift, the subtle, lasting change in how people responded to unanswered questions, how they treated uncertainty, how they understood responsibility. The echo of that anonymous call continued to ripple outward, not as a sound, but as a presence. A reminder that even decades-old truths can surface, and that when they do, they change more than a verdict. They change how a community listens. And in that listening, the case lived on,